The first snow of the season arrived without ceremony, which was how Nebraska panhandle winters announced themselves not with warning, but with presence. The world white before anyone had finished deciding whether to believe the clouds. By the time Idella Voss carried the last of the morning water from the well to the farmhouse kitchen, the yard had already gone silent in the particular way of newly fallen snow, sound absorbed into surfaces before it could travel. The hills to the west erased behind a curtain of gray that moved east across open ground, with the patience of something that had done this before and would do it again. She set the buckets down without looking at the snow. There was no useful information in looking at weather you could not change. She shut the door. The farm kept running anyway. That was the arrangement she had maintained for 5 years, arrive before anyone else woke finish. Before anyone else noticed, stay useful enough between tasks that her presence registered as necessary rather than inconvenient. It had been her mother's instruction offered from a sickbed the autumn before the money ran out, before her mother stopped answering altogether. Keep your hands moving, Idella. Busy hands make a body hard to argue with. She had followed the advice with the fidelity of someone who understood it was the last practical gift she would receive. She had kept her hands moving. She had been, by any accounting, indispensable. Indispensable had not been enough. Harlon Voss stood in the kitchen doorway when she turned from the window. He was wearing his good wool coat, not the barn coat, not the work coat, the good one he wore to town on matters of consequence. He had buttoned it to the throat before coming to find her, which meant the decision had been made before this morning. The decision had been dressed and ready, waiting only for the moment to deliver itself. "You're old enough now," he said. His voice carried no heat. Not cold either, just level, the voice of a man stating the conclusion of a calculation he had already completed. "Old enough to manage yourself." Idella looked at him without speaking. At 17, she had hauled water before dawn and split kindling long after dark. She had patched fencing in spring mud, harvested until her palms cracked and bled. Each October kept the root cellar organized with a system her aunt had never bothered with and her uncle had never acknowledged. She had done all of it under an arrangement she had understood to be mutual, her labor for her shelter, her silence for her continuance in this house. She had upheld her end with the thoroughness of someone who could not afford to do otherwise. Her aunt had died in July, quietly without drama between one breath and the next. The farmhouse had grown quieter in the weeks after then, colder in ways unrelated to the season, then strange the way familiar rooms become strange when grief settles into them and changes the weight of every object. Harlan had started looking at the supper table differently, counting chairs, counting portions. She had noticed and had not permitted herself to understand what she was noticing until now. Standing in the kitchen with the cold still in her coat and her boots still wet from the yard, he held out a canvas pack. She knew without looking yesterday's bread, 2 jars from the cellar, her father's folding knife. He had assembled it himself, which meant he had thought about this more than once. He had considered what to give her, which meant he had also considered what not to give. The pack was the precise shape of a man being fair enough to sleep afterward without difficulty. "There's work in town," he said. "Rooming houses, domestic work. You'll find something." Town was 11 miles across open ground. In clear weather, the walk consumed most of a day. Today was not clear weather, and he was looking slightly to the left of her face while he said it, which told her he was aware of the arithmetic and had decided to proceed regardless. Cruelty born from anger is at least honest about itself. It flares, it spends its heat, sometimes it even reverses. Cruelty born from convenience has no such instability. It is self-renewing. It requires no emotional fuel to sustain. Harlan was not angry. He was simply done, and the difference between those two conditions was the difference between a door that might open again someday and a door that had already been decided upon and locked from the inside. She took the pack. She did not say anything because nothing she could say would alter the arithmetic, and she had learned young that words spent on closed positions were words that cost something and returned nothing. She walked past him into the yard. The snow had covered the ground, evenly erasing the distinction between the path and the field on either side of it. She stood in the yard for a moment, not hesitating, just listening. From inside the house came the ordinary sounds of the morning. Continuing, a chair moved. The stove opened, the particular domestic sounds of a life proceeding without interruption. No one came back to the door. That absence confirmed everything she needed to know about the kind of thing this was. She turned toward the road. The first hour of walking was almost manageable. The snow was light enough that her boots found purchase without too much effort. The road still distinguishable beneath its white covering. The distance to the first landmark, a bent cottonwood at the valley's east fork, achievable in the time she calculated. She kept her pace measured, not fast enough to sweat through her coat, not slow enough to let cold accumulate in her stillness. She understood cold from the inside of it, not from instruction. She had helped carry a neighbor's frozen dog from a snowdrift one February morning when she was 13. She knew what the sequence looked like. By late morning, the snow thickened. Not dramatically, this was not a sky that announced its intentions. It simply delivered more of what it had been delivering steadily, the way a plain storm built its case over hours, rather than arriving fully formed. The bent cottonwood disappeared behind a curtain of white. The hills west of the valley had been gone for an hour already. The road beneath her feet became a surface she navigated more by memory than by sight, following the depression between fence rows that she knew existed even when she could not see it. Her boots were wrong for this. She had known it since the second mile. The left heel had been wearing through for a month, the sole retacking overdue, and by early afternoon, both feet had soaked through entirely. She cataloged this fact in the part of her mind she kept for unfixable things, real noted, not yet dangerous, requiring monitoring. She kept moving because movement was the only thermodynamics available to her. Standing still was not rest. It was heat leaving faster than she could make it. She left the road in the middle of the afternoon before the light failed, before the decision became desperate rather than deliberate. Most people in trouble stayed on open ground because open ground felt like progress, like destination, like the correct choice because it was the visible one. Idella had learned to distrust visible choices when invisible ones were available. The hills west of the road held stands of pine dense enough to break wind, rock formations in their irregularities that offered the possibility of structure. She had looked at those hills from the road dozens of times. She walked into them now. The climb was harder than estimation allowed for. Snow between rocks reached her knees in sheltered places. Twice she slipped on hidden ice beneath the surface layer. The first time she caught herself on an outstretched arm, took the impact in her wrist, and kept moving. The second time she went down on both knees against a rock she had not seen and sat for a moment in the snow afterward. Not from discouragement, but from the practical recognition that falling again the same way meant she had not absorbed the lesson. She slowed. She tested each step before committing. The light was going. Not quickly, but it was going, the gray sky deepening toward the particular shade that preceded darkness on overcast winter evenings. The cold had begun working through her coat in earnest, now not from outside in, but from inside out. The insulation saturated at the shoulders, where she had sweated in the first hour and the moisture had migrated. Cold inside clothing was different from cold outside it. It meant the body was spending heat faster than it was producing it. It meant the calculation had acquired a harder edge. She was scanning the hillside with focused attention. Not panic. Panic was an expenditure she could not afford when she saw the shadow. A dark rectangle set into the hillside. At the angle she was approaching in the failing light, it looked like a fold in the rock face, a shadow cast by an overhang. She almost moved past it. Then she stopped because the top edge of the shadow was straight. Straight lines did not occur in rock faces without being placed there by intention. She moved toward it carefully. As she got closer, shape resolved from shadow a door. Wood planks old, their grain roughened by years of freeze and thaw, set into a frame mortared into the rock face beneath a curved rise of earth that extended up the hillside above it. The rise itself was not natural once she understood it, not random slope, but shaped ground deliberately mounded. The kind of form you got when you piled earth over a structure and let decades of growth and weathering soften its original geometry. Someone had built here, long ago, with intention. The door's handle was iron, a simple ring driven into the vertical plank cold enough to burn through her coat cuff when she gripped it. She pulled. Nothing moved. She braced her feet, set her weight back, pulled harder. The resistance was swollen wood in a contracted frame, not locked, just old and stubborn. The resistance of something that had been closed for a long time and had forgotten how to open. She set her shoulder against the door's edge and pushed sideways while pulling the handle, combining forces at the angle she had used on the hay barn door when its bottom hinge had dropped. The wood groaned a low, reluctant sound, something waking and opened inward by 4 inches. Air came out, not warm, but different from what she had been breathing for 6 hours. Still air, protected air. The air of an interior space that had been sitting undisturbed long enough to reach a temperature entirely its own, separated from the surface world by wood and earth and stone. She held her face in the gap and breathed it. The risks of descending into an unknown underground structure in failing light were real, and she counted them: structural collapse, animal habitation, old wells, confined gas. She stood in the gap and counted them against the alternative, which was continuing up an icy hillside in the dark with soaked feet and compromised insulation. The risks inside the door were possible. The situation outside it was arithmetic approaching certainty. She went in. The door pulled shut behind her under its own weight, and the sound of the storm disappeared so completely it felt like a change in the quality of the world, rather than just the absence of noise. Underground silence was different from surface silence, closer, more directional, the kind that seemed to come from the walls rather than from the absence of activity. She stood still while her eyes attempted to adjust, found nothing useful in the total dark. Reached for the matchbox in her coat's inner pocket. 7 matches, she counted before striking. The first match showed her everything in 4 seconds of flame stone steps descending 8 feet to a packed earth floor, a chamber beyond them that extended further than she could resolve at the edges. Curved stone walls overhead, meeting in a timber-reinforced arch, the beams dark with age and the residue of old smoke. Along the far wall shelving, not one shelf, but 4 running floor to ceiling across the full width of the wall, with things on them. The match went out. She descended the steps in the dark with one hand trailing the wall. The stone under her fingers dressed flat on its inner face, shaped by tool rather than weathered smooth by water, the work of someone with time and intention. At the bottom, she struck the second match. She had 4 seconds she spent, none of them on anything but information. A small iron stove against the left wall square, bodied with a vertical pipe running upward at a slight angle. Beside it, split wood in 2 stacked rows. On a flat stone ledge beside the stack, in order, a tin cup, folded newspaper, a bundle of birch bark, strips, a cracked bowl holding a piece of steel and a flint chip. Everything needed in the place it would be needed, arranged by someone who had thought about the sequence of operations in the dark. The match went out. She moved to the stove by memory, her hands finding cold iron the firebox handle, then the flint and steel and birch bark by feel. In the dark, she arranged the bark by touch loosely, the way it needed to sit to catch without smothering, placed newspaper underneath with one edge exposed. She struck the flint. The spark missed. She adjusted the angle of the steel and struck again. The birch bark caught. She fed the fire with the discipline of someone who understood that this was her only attempt. Small splits first placed at angles that left air between them, then larger pieces as the flame established confidence. The draft in the pipe pulled immediately, the smoke rose without hesitation, without backing, which meant the chimney was clear and functioning, which meant the structure above was intact, which meant this had been built correctly. Good draft was not luck, it was engineering. Within minutes, the stove was burning with the self-sustaining sound of established combustion, and warmth began moving into the chamber, the way warmth moves in a stone room. Not from a point outward, but from all surfaces inward, accumulating rather than radiating. She pulled her boots off and held her feet near the iron without touching it. Sensation returned first as absence of feeling, then as pain, then as the dull, ordinary ache of tissue that has been cold long enough to be annoyed about it and is now recovering. She accepted this as information and waited it out. The firelight reached the shelves. She crossed the room and stood before them and looked without touching for a long moment first. Jars, dozens, sealed with wax over cloth, labeled in small, careful handwriting on paper strips. Carrots and brine beets, green beans, apple butter, dried corn preserved in liquid rounds of rendered beef, tallow wrapped in cloth. Below the jars, burlap sacks tied at the neck, which she pressed to confirm their contents. grain dry, giving under her fingers with the resistance of something that had been stored correctly. In the corner, barrels sealed with what smelled like pine pitch. Wooden crates packed with root vegetables separated by dry sand, each vegetable individual, not touching its neighbors, so that one soft spot could not spread. The separation was not habit, it was reasoning. She opened one jar, carrots cold firm in a light brine that had held its color. The smell when the seal broke vinegar and brown sugar, and underneath those, something she identified before she could name it, her aunt's kitchen in October. The steam from the canning pot, a jar lifted and tasted and set aside with a nod that meant it was right. The autumn before the counting began. The autumn before everything in the house began to feel like subtraction. She ate standing at the shelf with the jar in both hands. 3 carrots. She secured the lid and returned the jar to its exact position. Whoever had packed these shelves might still be coming back. She found the ledger on her second pass through the room after she had lit the lantern. She found hanging on a hook near the stove and allowed herself the fuller light. A wooden box on the lowest shelf sealed with a simple latch, the contents wrapped in oilskin inside canvas layers of protection against moisture, the wrapping of someone who considered the long term. Inside a cloth-bound ledger, its cover worn thin at the corners in the way of books that had been handled regularly over years. She carried it to the fireside and opened it. The first page, Edmund Puit, October 1871. The handwriting was deliberate and clear, each letter formed with the care of someone who wrote in poor light and needed to read it back by the same. She settled on the packed earth floor with her back against the warm wall of the stove and read. Puit had not been a man who wrote about himself if he could write about facts instead. His early entries were measurements outside temperature each morning, assessed by holding a bare wrist in the open door for 15 seconds. Wood supply counted by weight estimation against his established consumption rates. Food inventory updated when anything was added or removed. Between these measurements, occasional explanation. Built the east alcove this autumn. Ground temperature at 6 feet below frost line, maintains 47 degrees regardless of surface conditions. Stone in contact with that earth takes on the same stability. Not warm, constant. Most people do not understand that constant is more useful than warm. Below that, in a later hand, the same hand but slightly more compressed, the hand of a man writing faster and cold. The hill doesn't know it's November, that's the point. She read it twice. She looked at the stone wall in front of her and looked back at the page. Outside, she could hear the storm working across the hillside, a low sustained pressure against the world above her. Inside, the temperature had risen 15 degrees since she lit the stove and was still rising. Before the stove, before the fire, even then, even in the darkness, the air inside had been survivable. Because the hill had no opinion about the season. The hill maintained its own internal arithmetic regardless of what was happening on its surface. She kept reading. Puit's entries grew longer in the winters after 1871. The freeze that had killed his wife and son, he described in 3 sentences that she read once and did not return to. What followed those 3 sentences was the entire rest of the ledger, 7 winters of precision. The exact quantity of wood required per month at 3 temperature thresholds cross-referenced against the stove's output and the stone wall's thermal retention after a banked overnight fire. The discovery that root vegetables packed in sand lasted reliably until April, while those stored in open bins began softening by January. The observation that the chimney pipe angled 7 degrees east rather than vertical created a consistent pressure differential between the chamber's interior and the hilltop above, producing draft without backdraft on windy nights. He had arrived at 7 degrees through 2 failed configurations and 1 near suffocation he described in 4 words, nearly wrong this time. The 4th word was the only editorial comment in the entire ledger. The failures were as legible as the successes. More useful in some ways, they showed exactly what had been tried, measured, found insufficient, abandoned. The record of a mind that trusted data more than optimism. His final entry was dated 7 years before in November, the handwriting identical to the rest. Leg worse, going to town tomorrow before the road closes. Back by the week's end. No entry followed. She closed the ledger carefully and held it for a moment. He had gone to town and not come back. His system had continued without him. The temperature held, the food kept. The draft worked as though the absence of its builder was an irrelevance the system had already accounted for. She looked around the chamber, the stone walls, the shelved jars, the stove, with its carefully calculated pipe, the wood stacked in its considered order. She was not sitting in a hiding place. She was sitting inside a mind that had outlasted the man who made it, still running, still maintaining its discipline, still holding its 47 degrees against the cold that pressed from every surface outside. She found the secondary rooms on a second examination by lantern light. The first alcove held tools laid out in order by Type A, splitting maul, 2 hand saws in different gauges, draw knife set of chisels, the handles worn to the specific contours of one man's grip. The second alcove dried herbs in labeled bundles from low rafters, a tin funnel blocks of beeswax, a bottle of apple cider vinegar sealed with cloth and wax, extra jar lids still in their paper wrapper. He had provisioned for illness, for contamination, for equipment failure. He had thought about ruin from every direction and had prepared for each of them separately. She returned to the main chamber and lay down on the bunk with the old blanket stiff with age dry, throughout which was the essential quality pulled to her chin. The fire settled into the sound of established balance, not crackling now but breathing steadily, the slow in and out of combustion that had found its rate. The warmth from the walls was different from the warmth from the stove, more diffuse without direction. The warmth of mass returning what had been put into it slowly and without variation. She thought about Harlon and his good coat in the kitchen doorway. She thought about the canvas pack assembled with the arithmetic of fairness. She thought about 11 miles of road she had not reached the end of, and the town at the far side of it that had not been expecting her. Then she let those things settle to the floor of her mind where they could wait. They were not actionable tonight. What was actionable was this: she was warm, she was dry, she was not hungry, she had wood food, a functioning stove, the detailed instructions of a careful man preserved in waterproof wrapping on the shelf 6 feet away. Whatever came next would have to wait until tomorrow. Tomorrow existed again. She had not been certain of that until the carrots. She closed her eyes. The storm moved across the hill above her in long waves, spending itself against an obstacle that had been built specifically to give nothing back. The stove ticked as the iron expanded in the heat. The hill held its temperature. The shelves held their contents in the dark. She slept. She woke before light by the habit of someone who had never been permitted to sleep past usefulness. For 2 seconds, the curved ceiling above her was unfamiliar. Then the smell of the room-old ironstone dried herbs from the back alcove. The particular mineral cold of undisturbed earth returned her to herself completely. She sat up. The stove had burned to coals red through the grate, still alive, still functional. She had not banked it before sleeping. She noted the carelessness without dwelling on it, and fed the coals carefully until the flame rebuilt, then set the draft for a sustained burn and turned to the room. She inventoried with the same attention she had given the root cellar at the Voss farm for 5 years, because that habit did not require a farmhouse to function. Every jar, every sack, the crate contents assessed by weight and press. She ran Pruitt's consumption figures against the quantities available. He had recorded his own monthly usage with the precision of someone who understood that precision was survival and built the calculation in her head, holding the numbers the way she had always held things she could not afford to forget. For one person, food through April wood through March with conservative burning. For 5 people, food through the end of January. For 10 people, the question became a different kind of question. She wrote nothing down because she had nothing to write with. She kept the figures arranged in the careful interior space she had used all her life for things that mattered and could not be lost. On the 3rd day it snowed again, and on the 5th morning she heard the knock. 2 impacts against the outer door unevenly spaced the sound of a fist that had not been certain it was hitting wood until the second try. She was at the stove. She stood still for a moment. An animal would not knock twice. Someone intending harm would not knock at all, then climbed the steps and put her ear to the door. A woman's voice, thin from cold and distance, pressing through the wood. "Hello, is anyone? We saw the smoke?" She opened the door. Ruth Callum stood in the hillside snow with a child on her hip. The child's face turned into her shoulder. Ruth was perhaps 30, dark-haired, wearing wool that had been adequate for a different winter. The child, 4 years old at most, wearing mittens cut down from an adult's pair, The excess fabric folded under and stitched did not look up when the door opened. She had reached the stage past curiosity, the stage where the body had turned its resources entirely inward and had nothing spare for the world outside itself. Ruth's eyes moved past Idella to the amber light at the bottom of the steps. "We saw smoke," she said again. The repetition was not carelessness. It was a woman running on the last of what she had, using words she had already assembled because assembling new ones required energy she was allocating elsewhere. "I didn't know what this was. We've been walking." Idella stepped back from the doorway. "Come inside." Ruth descended the steps with the child still on her hip, testing each one, and at the bottom she stopped. The warmth of the chamber arrived at her all at once, not dramatically, but as a fact that required processing before anything else could proceed. She stood still for a moment with her eyes closed. The child stirred against her shoulder and made a small sound that was not a word. Her name was Josephine, 4 years old. Her father had died in April, a horse accident on the North Road, the kind that required no elaboration, and Ruth and Josephine had been 3 miles southwest when the storm hit. The wood pile had been lower than she had planned for. By the third night, she had burned the kitchen table and both chairs. She had made the decision to walk on the fourth morning. Josephine unwrapped from the cut-down mittens, spread her small chapped hands near the stove without being told to. She had been cold long enough that heat required no instruction. Idella found the apple butter and opened it and offered a spoon, and the girl looked at it with the careful attention of someone confirming a thing is real before committing to it. Then she held the jar in both hands and ate with complete concentration, and Idella let her, because some hungers were more than physical and required more than portion control to address. "What is this place?" Ruth asked. "A system," Idella said. "Then a man built it. He's been gone 7 years. He left instructions." Ruth looked at the ledger on its shelf. Instructions. For winter, specifically for winters like this one. Ruth turned back to the stove and said nothing further. She had the quality of someone who had asked the questions she needed answered and received sufficient answer. She was warm. Her daughter was eating. The larger questions could wait in the order she chose to reach them. That was the first day. Silas Dent arrived that same evening, having followed the disturbance. Ruth's tracks had left in the hillside snow before the afternoon wind scoured them flat. He was 58 broad through the chest and shoulders, in the way of men who had spent 4 decades moving material weight rather than managing it with hands so damaged by the cold that 3 of his knuckles had split to the quick. He had wrapped the splits in strips torn from a flour sack. He descended the steps without assistance, looked at the stove, looked at the number of people in the chamber, looked at Idella. "Wood supply," he said. Not a question, a request for the relevant figure. 14 days at current rate, she said. 18 if we bank correctly overnight. He nodded once and moved to the east wall, where he sat down with his back against the stone. She noticed that he had chosen the most thermally stable position in the room without being directed to it. The wall that backed against the hillside maintained a temperature. The stove's variability could not touch the hill's stored mass, bleeding through the stone steadily in both directions. He had found it by instinct, or by the accumulated knowledge of a man who had wintered in enough structures to know where the reliable warmth lived. She registered the choice. She said nothing about it. Horace and Cal Merritt arrived on the 6th morning, having spent 2 nights in a hay barn 4 miles east, before that barn's roof gave under the snow load in the early hours of the second night. Horace was 23, Cal 20, and they had the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from physical emergency, followed by sustained uncertainty. The adrenaline spent the body now presenting its invoice. Cal's left hand had a frostbite patch across 2 fingers, the skin waxy and pale in a way that required monitoring. She examined it without comment, confirmed it had not progressed to the stage requiring intervention beyond warming and protection, wrapped it in a strip of cloth from Pruitt's supply alcove, where the spare materials were kept in labeled order. Cal watched her work. "You a nurse?" "No." She tied off the wrapping. Pruitt kept a medical section in his ledger. 3rd winter, he treated his own frostbite. He was precise about what he did and what the outcome was. Cal looked at his wrapped hand. "Who's Pruitt?" "The man who built this." She moved back to the stove to check the burn rate. "He's been dead 7 years probably. He knew more about staying alive in a Nebraska winter than anyone I've met. Horace from across the room had been looking at the shelves since he arrived. All that food, is it ours to use? It's here, Idella said. We're here. Pruitt's ledger doesn't address ownership under these circumstances, but his entire methodology was built around the premise that preparation exists to be used when it's needed. She paused. It's needed. Mabel Strand appeared on the seventh morning without explanation of origin or distance traveled. She was somewhere between 55 and 70, the range impossible to narrow further, with the kind of face that had been weathered past the point where age left obvious markers. She came down the steps, assessed the room in one slow turn of her head, found a position against the south wall, began removing her outer layers with the efficiency of someone who had done this, found shelter in extremity, organized herself within it before. She did not introduce herself immediately. When she did, it was only the name offered flatly, as though the rest of her history was not currently relevant information. 7 people. The chamber Pruitt had built for one man's solitary precision now held 7, and the calculation changed in every direction simultaneously. Idella recalculated. She did not call a meeting. She did not explain her reasoning before implementing it, because explanation required consensus, and consensus required energy. The room did not have to spare. She simply began adjusting things, and the adjustments explained themselves. Wood moved to a position accessible to the overnight watch without disturbing sleepers. The food inventory she had been maintaining in her head, she transferred to the ledger's back page's quantities. Pruitt's established caloric values per person per day. The supply curve projected against 7 people through the duration of what a December storm on the Nebraska Panhandle could reasonably be expected to last. She organized sleeping positions by thermal logic. Josephine and Cal's damaged hand near the warmest wall, the larger bodies at the room's perimeter, where their own mass contributed to the insulation of the space. Horace questioned his assigned position. He was not hostile about it. He was 23 and accustomed to being the one who decided where he slept. He looked at the spot Idella indicated and looked at the spot he had chosen near the stove and said he thought he'd stay where he was. Silas Dent from his corner without looking up. She knows the room. Horace moved. She put Horace to work on the door seal the following morning because the gap along the bottom had been sending a thin current of cold air across the floor during wind gusts, and the floor temperature in the area where Josephine slept was measurably lower than the rest of the chamber as a result. Pruitt had addressed this in his second winter. She had found the relevant entry, read it twice, understood the method. She showed Horace what to do, and he did it. His hands more practiced than hers at the mechanical precision of fitting material into irregular gaps. They worked together without conversation beyond what the task required. When the seal was complete, the floor temperature in the sleeping area improved within the hour. Mabel, without instruction or consultation, assumed management of the morning food distribution. Her system differed from Idella's in its specific arithmetic, but arrived at the same result, equal portions calibrated to the remaining supply and the estimated duration, and she accomplished it in less time. Idella observed this and stepped back from the task entirely. She had learned from 5 years of maintaining a household under someone else's authority that the fastest way to waste a capable person was to supervise them on a task they had already mastered. Ruth managed Josephine. That was by any honest accounting a full-time occupation. The child had recovered her animation within 2 days of the chamber's warmth. She investigated everything accessible: the lower shelves, the texture of the stone walls, the grain sacks in the back alcove, which she had identified as the ideal seat, and returned to repeatedly the dried herb bundles in the tool alcove, which she examined with the serious taxonomic interest of someone building a private classification system. She asked questions in the direct, unembarrassed way of 4-year-olds, directing them at whoever happened to be nearest. Silas received the most of them, possibly because he was the largest person in the room, and she had some theory about correlation between size and available information. He answered each one, briefly, specifically, without condescension. He knew the names of things, tools, plants, structural materials, with the specificity of a man who had spent his life in direct contact with them, and Josephine received each answer with the gravity of someone who understood she was being given real information. Idella watched this from across the room and said nothing. She was not hiding below ground. She was thinking below it. The second storm came on the 8th day. She had tracked its approach for 36 hours beforehand through the door gap temperature readings she took each morning and evening, through a change in the chimney draft she had first noticed in Pruitt's 1876 entries as a reliable precursor, a subtle increase in draw velocity as barometric pressure dropped ahead of major systems, and through a quality in the sound the hill made after midnight, a low-frequency vibration that was not quite wind and preceded it. She told the chamber the evening before a significant system, likely severe, requiring specific preparation. Nobody asked her how she knew. By the 8th day, they had sufficient evidence for her competence that the question was unnecessary. They prepared. Additional wood carried from the back alcove and stacked in the main chamber within arm's reach of the stove, enough for 3 days of continuous burning, without requiring anyone to navigate the alcove passage in the dark. The outer door reinforced with a timber brace, Horace fashioned from spare lumber, the brace seated at an angle that would resist inward pressure rather than add to it. The ventilation duct in the east wall, a secondary pipe Pruitt had installed at knee height, fitted with a sliding iron cover, tested and confirmed functional, providing the minimum air exchange required to keep the chamber breathable without meaningfully compromising its thermal stability. The food Mabel had been distributing from the central shelving moved to the east wall's consistent temperature, away from the stove's variable heat. The storm arrived in the early afternoon without preliminary, not a building a transition. 1 hour the snow was steady and manageable. The next the wind had reached the kind of sustained velocity that changed the sound profile of everything it touched. The outer door braced held. The brace Horace had built seated itself more firmly under the increasing pressure, the physics working in the direction he had designed for. The chamber's sound changed. The storm outside became a continuous presence rather than a variable one, a freight quality that pressed against the hill from every exposed surface, while the buried room beneath maintained its disciplines. Josephine had been quieter than her recovered self all day. Idella noticed it in the morning and kept the observation in the part of her mind she reserved for developing situations real noted, not yet requiring action, requiring monitoring. The girl was pressed against Ruth's side on the warm wall, her position correct, her mother's arm around her shoulders, everything arranged as it should be. But Josephine, who had spent the previous 4 days naming every herb bundle in the back alcove and asking Silas the function of each tool on the tool alcove wall, had gone interior. Not sleeping, conserving. By early evening, the sound of her breathing had changed. Ruth looked at Idella across the chamber. She did not speak. Her eyes said everything the situation required. Idella crossed the room and crouched beside Josephine, pressing the back of her wrist to the child's forehead. Warm, more than ambient, the specific warmth of a body running its furnace higher than normal to compensate for something. The girl's hands, when Idella took one between both of her own, were cold, despite the wall behind her and the room's general temperature. Cold hands elevated head temperature, respiration audible and shallow. Not the shallow of sleep, but the shallow of a body, pulling its resources away from the extremities, concentrating them at the core, spending heat faster at the margins than the room could replace it. Ruth's voice low enough not to carry to the others she should be closer to the fire. Idella did not answer immediately. She held the small, cold hand and thought about Pruitt's observation from the winter of 1873, the entry she had marked with a strip of canvas on her second day in the chamber, because it had seemed wrong to her instincts, and she had wanted to return to it until she understood why it was right. Rapid temperature change causes the body to work against itself. Place a cold object against stable mass, not against variable heat. The stone knows how to give it back slowly, the fire does not. The stove produced heat that swung dramatically with each addition of wood. Hot near the iron body, cool 2 feet away, cycling every 20 minutes through the peaks and troughs of its combustion rhythm. The east wall had been receiving indirect warmth from the stove for 8 days. It had become a reservoir returning heat at the temperature of the hill itself, modified upward by a week of human habitation, steady, unhurried, without the stove's fluctuation. What a cold body needed was not intensity, it needed consistency. Something it could read, respond to, climb back along without the confusion of a signal that kept changing. "No," Idella said quietly. "Keep her where she is." Ruth's hand tightened on her daughter's shoulder. "The fire is hotter." "The wall doesn't change." Idella adjusted Josephine's position so that the child's back was in full contact with the stone rather than offset by the angle of sitting, then shifted the blanket to cover the gap between shoulder and wall. Her body is trying to find a stable temperature to climb toward. It can follow something constant. It can't follow something that spikes every 15 minutes. Ruth sat very still. The storm outside had reached its sustained peak, the hill absorbing the sound into a continuous low vibration rather than letting it through as impact. Josephine slept within 40 minutes. Not the interior withdrawal of before genuine sleep, the unlocked kind, her breathing evening out from the shallow monitoring rhythm into the deeper, slower pattern of a body that had found something stable enough to trust. The visible tension around her eyes, the held quality she had carried all day, released incrementally over the next half hour until her face had the complete absence of effort, that is, the specific achievement of a sleeping child. Ruth looked at Idella over the girl's head. The look was not gratitude. Gratitude was too small a container for what was in it. It was recognition. The specific recognition of someone who has just watched a thing be done correctly, under conditions where being wrong would have been catastrophic. Idella went back to the stove and fed it. She kept her face directed toward the iron and the wood and the technical requirements of maintaining the fire at its established rate. Silas from his corner caught her eye when she turned. He held it for 3 seconds, then looked away. He had watched everything. He did not require the situation to be spoken about. The storm ran through the night at its sustained pitch and into the following day without significant change. They maintained the fire in 2-hour shifts, the rotation Idella had established on the first night for reasons of efficiency and had not needed to explain since. The timber brace held, the chimney draft held, the 7-degree angle performing across the full duration of a major system, exactly what Puit had spent 2 failed configurations and 1 near suffocation arriving at. Josephine woke the next morning asking for the apple butter. Ruth closed her eyes briefly when she heard it, that specific request in that specific voice, carrying the ordinary appetite of a child who was fully present and demanding things from the world again. She reached for the jar without being asked. She did not say anything. Her hands were not entirely steady when she opened it. In the quiet after Josephine had eaten and begun a detailed reinspection of the grain sacks, she had apparently decided required reevaluation. Mabel Strand began humming. Barely audible, a repeated phrase of melody, old and plain, the kind learned before music, became a thing you sought out rather than a thing you simply knew. She stopped after perhaps 30 seconds, apparently unaware she had started. The sound had moved through the chamber without announcement and done its work in the space between the storm noise and the breathing of 7 people who had been for one night genuinely uncertain about a 4-year-old. Nobody mentioned it. There was nothing to add. The storm weakened on the 3rd day and died in the night of the 4th, leaving behind the specific silence of aftermath. Not the silence before a storm which carried anticipation, but the silence after which carried inventory. Idella opened the outer door at first light and stood in the entrance looking down at the valley. The road was gone, not difficult to see absent its surface, indistinguishable from the fields on either side the fence posts that marked its edges buried to their midpoints, in drifts that had consolidated overnight into something closer to terrain than weather. The distances between farmhouses had been erased. She could not see the Voss farm from this angle. She did not look for it. The town was visible 3 miles east, its smoke rising in the windless morning air. Thin columns vertical, which meant the storm had fully passed and the atmosphere had stabilized. She looked at it for a moment and went back inside. There was work to do. The supply calculation required updating against the quantities actually consumed over 4 storm days versus her projected rate. The door brace needed assessment for any stress damage from the sustained pressure. Cal's frostbitten fingers needed unwrapping and re-examination. The ventilation duct cover had developed a slight resistance in its slide mechanism from the temperature cycling. And if it seized completely, the air exchange would drop below the minimum Puit had established as safe for 7 people in a sealed chamber. She addressed each of these in order, moving through the task with the same quality of attention she brought to all of them. Not urgency which wasted itself, but the steady, directed focus of someone who understood that a system maintained was a system that continued to function. It was on the 12th day, 4 days after the storm broke, 8 days since Ruth and Josephine had first knocked that Harlon Voss appeared at the outer door. She heard him before she reached the steps. Her name called twice through the wood in the functional voice she had heard daily for 5 years. The voice that used her name, the way it used the names of tools accurately without warmth, because warmth had never been part of the arrangement. She climbed the steps and opened the door. He stood in the hillside snow in his good wool coat. His face was red from cold, but not damaged by it. He had not been walking long, had not crossed from discomfort into danger. Behind him, the storm's aftermath lay across the hillside, in the sculpted forms of consolidated drifts, the surface crusted from overnight freezing, catching the morning light in the flat way of ice rather than the soft way of fresh snow. The loft barn's north wall had failed, he said. The structure was compromised. The farmhouse would hold, but without the barn, the animals would not survive another major storm. And another major storm was a question of when rather than whether. He had seen the smoke from the hill during a break in the weather, and he had come because Harlon Voss was a man who pursued available options with the same methodical efficiency he applied to everything else. She stepped back from the doorway. He came down the steps and stopped at the bottom. The chamber in the morning had the quality of a space that had been inhabited through difficulty and had absorbed the record of it, not unpleasant but specific, the smell and warmth of 7 people in a sustained fire and a week of human life conducted in close quarters. He looked at the shelves at the organized sleeping areas, at Josephine sitting with her grain sack in the corner conducting what appeared to be a detailed audit of its exterior surface. He looked at the ledger on its shelf. He looked at Idella. He said nothing about November. She said nothing about November. There was no version of that conversation that produced useful information for either of them, and they were both at the root of it, practical people. She handed him a tin cup of the bean broth Mabel had started that morning from dried stock and a piece of salt pork. He took it. He sat against the nearest section of wall, not the warmest wall. He did not know the room and drank without speaking. His eyes moved around the chamber with the assessing quality of a man who builds and maintains things and cannot stop evaluating structures for their logic. She watched him arrive in the set of his jaw and the slight stilling of his expression, at the understanding that this had been built correctly, that whoever had built it had known things about winter that the valley had not bothered to know. He stayed 4 days. He worked. That was the currency he had, and the one the situation accepted physical competence applied to specific problems. He and Horace reinforced the outer door's frame where the storm pressure had worked a slow stress fracture into the mortar at the upper left corner. He carried the heaviest loads from the back alcove without being asked, having assessed on his second day that the passage was too narrow for efficient 2-person operation and that single trips with maximum load were faster than multiple trips with minimum weight. He moved through the chamber's routines with the closed-off efficiency of a man who has decided that usefulness is the only available language for a situation he did not design. On the morning he left, he stood at the bottom of the steps and looked at her for a moment that lasted longer than practical purpose required. The chamber behind her had its morning quality, inhabited warmth, the sound of the fire at its established rate, Josephine's voice asking Silas something about the splitting maul, and Silas answering it with the same flat specificity he brought to all her questions. Harlon turned without speaking about November. The outer door closed. The draft from his departure briefly changed the room's pressure, and the fire in the stove responded by burning slightly brighter for a few seconds before returning to its established rhythm as though the room had noticed the change and corrected for it. She went back to the stove. The remaining days of the storm's aftermath passed in the rhythm the chamber had established: fire management, food distribution. Josephine's ongoing project of knowing everything in the room by name. Silas's particular quality of silence that was more present than most people's conversation. Mabel's efficient movement through the space with the authority of someone who had found her function and was performing it without requiring acknowledgement. Horace and Cal Merritt. As the weather permitted, more movement began ranging up the hillside to assess conditions, returning with reports that Idella added to her ongoing calculation of when the valley below would be accessible and what condition it would be in when it was. Horace asked her on the 15th day how she had known to go up into the hills instead of staying on the road. "The road goes somewhere," she said. The hills offered shelter. Shelter was the immediate problem. He thought about this. He was 23 and had grown up in a family that moved toward destinations rather than toward conditions, which was a reasonable approach to ordinary weather. Most people would have stayed on the road. Most people do, she said. He looked at the chamber around him, the stone walls, the organized shelves, the stove with its careful pipe angle, Josephine currently explaining to Cal the difference between two specific bundles of dried herbs based on criteria she had apparently developed independently. Lucky thing, he said. Lucky that I looked, she said. The door was there whether I looked or not. He did not have an immediate answer to that. She did not wait for one. The valley came back to itself slowly, the way things come back from prolonged pressure, not in a single reversal, but in a sequence of small reclamations each morning, returning slightly more of what the storm had taken. The road reappeared as a depression between fence lines before it reappeared as a surface. The creek along the valley's eastern edge had redirected itself around a new ice blockage, cutting a secondary channel through a low field it had not used in anyone's memory. 3 homesteads that the community had assumed occupied turned out when men finally reached them in the second week after the storm to be empty families who had left before the first November snow and had not sent word their departures, absorbed into the general silence of a valley managing its own emergency. Idella learned these things in pieces carried by whoever arrived at the chamber door as the weather permitted travel. The information assembled itself into a picture of a valley that had survived the winter's first serious statement, but had done so at considerable cost. Wood piles halved or destroyed by moisture penetration when storage structures failed. Food stores lower than planned because planning had assumed a mobility between homesteads that the storm had eliminated. Livestock losses running from significant to total depending on how the barn had been built and how the barn had been oriented and whether the family in question had understood before this winter that those two facts were related. The chamber had come through it with 60% of its original food stores and enough wood for another 3 weeks at the rate they had been burning. People began leaving as the road became passable. Horace and Cal Merritt went first, needing to reach town to send word to family. Silas Dent stayed 4 days longer than they did, not because he had nowhere to go, but because he appeared to be conducting his own assessment of the chamber and its principles, moving through it in his careful way, spending time in the back alcove with the construction notes in Pruitt's ledger, which Idella had shown him without ceremony when he asked. He read slowly the way she read the way people read who had taught themselves and understood that speed was not the point. On the morning he left, he paused at the bottom of the steps and looked at the east wall for a moment, the wall that had maintained Josephine's recovery, that had held its temperature through the worst night of the storm without variation. He did not say anything about it. He put his coat on and went up the steps and out into a morning that had finally, after 3 weeks, produced sunlight. Mabel Strand left the way she had arrived without announcement. Her departure registered only by her absence from her position against the south wall and the fact that the morning food distribution did not happen until Idella took it over. She had left the tin measuring cup she had been using in its exact position on the shelf beside the food stores as though it belonged to the room rather than to her. Ruth and Josephine stayed the longest. Josephine had long since reclaimed her full self. The questions, the taxonomic projects, the grain sack seat, the ongoing audit of Silas's answers against whatever interior system she had developed for evaluating information. On the 16th day, she found a mouse in the far corner of the back alcove and spent the better part of an afternoon attempting to establish diplomatic relations with it, an effort that the mouse declined with consistency but without apparent hostility. Ruth watched from the doorway with the specific expression of a mother who has learned to let certain projects proceed to their natural conclusions. Ruth came to find Idella in the main chamber on the 17th morning with the quality of someone who has completed an internal deliberation. "Tomorrow," she said, "if the road holds another day." Idella looked up from the ledger where she had been adding her own entries to the back pages in the smaller, more compressed handwriting that looked nothing like Pruitt's, but occupied his margins with the same fidelity to specific observation. "The homestead, what's standing of it?" Ruth said this without inflection, the flat accuracy of someone describing a logistical situation rather than mourning one. "Horace sent word through the Dent farm. The walls held. Interior needs work. It's there to go back to. Idella set the pencil in the ledger's spine. The wood situation for the rest of winter. I've thought about that. I know you have. Idella looked at her steadily. Ruth Callum had walked 3 miles through 2 days of a blizzard with a 4-year-old because she had burned her kitchen furniture and still come up short, which was not a failure of management but a failure of the margin available to her. The margin that a November alone on a homestead with a 4-year-old and a recently dead husband had left. Idella understood this with the precision of someone who had also operated on margins that did not forgive miscalculation. There's a cord and a half in the back alcove. More than the chamber needs to close out winter. Take what you can carry. Ruth was quiet. That's Pruitt's wood. Pruitt left instructions, Idella said. Not a deed. Something shifted in Ruth's face, not quite a smile occupying the same region. She looked at the ledger with Idella's handwriting in its margins at the shelves, with their maintained order at the room that had held 7 people through the worst of it. What will you do, she asked. After this. After. Idella let the word exist for a moment without deflecting it. After was a territory she had not spent time in the habit of 5 years of precarious arrangement, was to address the immediate and leave the next thing until it was also immediate. She looked at the room around her, the stone walls, the system running with the precision Pruitt had built into it, her own entries accumulating in the ledger's margins. The chamber had not asked her to be more than she was. It had asked her to maintain what existed, observe, accurately apply what she observed. That had turned out to be enough for more than just herself. I don't know yet, she said. It was the most honest answer she had, and Ruth received it the way Ruth received most honest things, without requiring it to be more than it was. They left the next morning with the cord of wood loaded onto a sled Ruth had built from lumber in the tool alcove, Josephine riding on top of the woodpile, with the authority of someone who had determined this was the correct position and saw no reason to negotiate. At the bottom of the hill before the flat ground began, Josephine turned and looked back up at the door. The look lasted several seconds, concentrated, proprietary, the expression of a 4-year-old who has decided something belongs to her in a category that does not require explanation. Then Ruth said her name quietly and they moved toward the road, their tracks straight in the crusted snow, and the sound of them diminished and then was gone. The chamber held its silence. Idella stood in the center of it without moving. Not inventory, she had done inventory this morning, and nothing had changed since. Just standing in the room that had been for 3 weeks full of other people's needs and requirements and questions, and was now full of nothing but the temperature it maintained and the sound of the fire at its established rate. The stove ticked, the chimney drew, the east wall held its hill temperature in the stone without announcement. She had things to do. The food stores wanted reorganizing now that the population had returned to one. The tool alcove needed assessment for anything damaged during the storm period. The structural notes in Pruitt's ledger included a spring inspection protocol for the chamber's integrity after a hard winter, and she intended to execute it. There was no shortage of work. She stood in the center of the room and let the work wait. Turner Crane came in the last week of February on a morning that had the particular quality of late winter plains days when the cold persists, but something in the angle of the light has shifted a quality that was not warmth, but was the announcement of the possibility of warmth still several weeks away. She heard his footsteps on the hillside before he reached the door. Deliberate, unhurried, the steps of a man who knew where he was going and had decided how he felt about going there before he started. She opened the door while he was still 3 feet from it. He was 44, broad-faced, wearing an expression she recognized, a man who has arrived at a position after considerable internal resistance and is now committed to it without being comfortable about the commitment. He had a reputation in the valley as a man whose certainty preceded him by several minutes. She had heard his name in connection with the community's unspoken consensus about which families were managing and which were not. He had not been among those who came to the chamber during the storm. He looked past her into the interior. The morning fire gave the steps their amber light. Heard about this place, he said. Heard you kept people through it. She waited. There was more. She could hear it in the way he had placed those 2 sentences. He looked at the carved timber above the doorframe. Pruitt's structural beam notched with temperature observations in the physical ledger he had kept in the material itself marks that she had spent an afternoon in her second week deciphering and cross-referencing against the written ledger. Turner's eyes moved along the notches slowly. Lost 8 head, he said. Barn held, but the gaps I hadn't filled let the cold through. Second week I was burning furniture. He said this in the accounting voice the valley had apparently adopted collectively for describing what the winter had taken flat specific without self-pity, because self-pity required a surplus of emotional energy that the winter had spent along with everything else. Saw your smoke from the valley when the storm broke enough to see anything. Asked around about what this was. He paused. Found out about Pruitt. She had not expected him to know the name. She looked at him. Smart man, Turner said. Precise, she said. It's not the same thing. Precision is more reliable. He looked at her, then with the direct attention of a man recalibrating, not the look past her that people used when they were talking about a place or a situation rather than to the person in front of them, but a look that registered her as the primary fact. He held it for a moment. The ground temperature, he said, below frost line. It stays consistent. Within a narrow range. Pruitt measured this hillside at 47 degrees at 6 feet consistent across 7 winters. The range varies by location and soil composition, but the principle holds. The earth below the frost line has its own thermal arithmetic that operates independently of surface conditions. She paused, then added the part she had come to understand as the actual point. You built a roof. Pruitt built a reason. He was still for a moment. Then he looked past her into the room. I'd like to read that ledger. She stepped back from the doorway. He spent 4 hours with the ledger open across his knees, reading in the purposeful way of a man extracting information he intends to apply, moving between sections, returning to specific entries, occasionally looking up at the stove or the walls to confirm a detail against its physical instance. He asked her 3 questions during that time. The first was about the chimney angle and how Pruitt had arrived at 7 degrees. She described the 2 failed configurations and the near suffocation and the specific measurements Pruitt had recorded for each failure. The second was about the depth required for consistent thermal mass in the soil type common to the valley's western edge, which she could not answer with precision, but could point him to Pruitt's observational notes on soil variation. The third was about the spring structural inspection protocol, which she had not yet executed and told him so. When he left, he took no notes, carried no transcription. He had the memory of a man who built things the kind that retained structural specifications by the same instinct that retained the feel of a level surface under a hand. At the door he paused. You staying through spring? Through April at least, she said. After that, I don't know. He nodded once and went down the hill. She did not watch him go. She went back to the ledger and added a note to the margin of the chimney entry, a clarification that had occurred to her while explaining it to him, the way explanations sometimes clarify the thing to the explainer as much as to the recipient. The winter finished in the gradual, unspectacular way of plains winters, when they are done, not a single warm day that announced spring, but a slow accumulation of mornings that were slightly less cold than the one before the change, perceptible only in retrospect. By March, the overnight fire was a comfort rather than a necessity. By the first week of April, the stove ran only in the mornings. The hills stored thermal mass from the winter's sustained heating sufficient to maintain the chamber above the threshold that required active management. Pruitt had noted this in the ledger. The system ran hot in deep winter and coasted in early spring on its own reserves. The hill remembered summer even in April. It paid the memory back slowly without being asked. A woman came in late March whose name Idella never learned. She arrived from the South Road direction carrying a covered basket and set it on the top step of the chamber entrance, and was already walking back down the hill when Idella opened the door. The basket held a wheel of hard cheese and a folded wool shawl knitted in dark blue yarn with the particular density of work done in small increments over many evenings, 3 weeks of making at minimum. Idella looked at it for a moment before picking it up. She wore it every morning through the remainder of winter and into spring. She did not know whose hands had made it. She suspected that was how it had been intended. In April, 2 men from the valley came with questions about drainage, a flooding problem one of them had in a low field each spring, thaw water rising through the ground rather than running off the surface. They had heard she had Pruitt's ledger. The ledger's water management sections addressed earth-sheltered structures rather than field drainage, but the underlying principles translated, and she walked them through the relevant entries and let them ask the questions the entries generated. They left with better questions than they had arrived with. She took this as the correct outcome. In May, she began building, not the chamber. Puit's chamber she left as it was its door functional, its contents maintained its temperature held by the hill as it had always been held. What she built was a single room on the east slope of the same hill above ground, applying the thermal mass principles from the ledger to a structure that received direct light south-facing stone-walled with an earthen berm along the north face that she packed and seeded with grass by midsummer. It was not a reproduction of the chamber. It was the chamber's logic applied to different conditions, the way you applied any principle not by copying the instance, but by understanding what the instance was doing and finding the equivalent action in the new context. She moved into it in June. Turner Crane came in August. She was on the hillside above his property checking the drainage markers Puit had established along the slope in 1879 when she saw him in the low field at the north edge of his land. He was not farming it. He was digging. The excavation had the shape she recognized without needing to think about it. An oblong form angled into the hillside's edge, wider than a standard root cellar. The cut face at the deliberate angles of someone working from a specific design rather than approximating. He was using a spade and a mattock working alone, throwing dirt in the consistent rhythm of a man who had decided something and was now simply in the execution of it. The displaced earth at the perimeter suggested he had been at this for several days. He did not look up toward the hillside. She watched him for perhaps 2 minutes. He worked with his back to the hill, steady, unhurried, the posture of someone not concerned with being observed, because being observed was not the point of what he was doing. She turned and followed the drainage line back along the slope to its origin and made the notes she had come to make. He was building a reason. She had not needed him to tell her. She had not needed him to look up. The shape of the whole was the entire conversation. The autumn came with the particular generosity of plains autumns after difficult winters, as though the season understood it had an account to settle. Warm days extending into October. The valley's recovery visible in the new structures going up, the repaired fences, the enlarged storage facilities that several families had built over the summer, not identical to Puit's system. Each one adapted to the specific terrain and resources of the land it sat on, but recognizably informed by the same underlying logic. Nobody called it anything. The knowledge moved through the valley the way useful knowledge always moves in thinly settled places, through observation, through the questions people asked when they came to look at something that had worked through the particular education of a winter that had demonstrated exactly what insufficient preparation cost. The chamber on the hill began appearing in those conversations as a reference point rather than as her achievement or Puit's legacy. It had become a feature of the valley's working knowledge, the way the creek was a feature and the road was a feature, a thing that existed that had a function that people oriented themselves against when they were figuring out where they were and what they needed. She was not sure when that had happened. Gradually, she suspected, the way the wall's heat accumulated. In November, the November after 1 year from the morning, Harlon had stood in the kitchen doorway in his good coat. She walked the south road past the Voss farm. She was not going there. She was walking from the valley's eastern edge back toward her place on the hill, and the south road was the direct line. The farm came into view as it always had from that direction, the barn with its repaired north wall visible first, timber bright where the new lumber had been fitted. Then the house with its kitchen chimney smoke rising in the thin, straight column of a managed fire. The yard was clear. The fences were intact. The farm was functional. She kept walking at her pace. Harlon was near the repaired barn wall when she passed too far for his expression to be readable, close enough to confirm he was there. Whether he saw her on the road, she could not determine and did not need to. They had said everything available to be said by November of last year, which was nothing. They had nothing further to add. She had come from his house and built something in a hill and kept 7 people alive through a blizzard, and was now walking back to the place she had built. And he had repaired his barn wall, and each of them had arrived at their respective situations by the particular route available to them. She kept walking. The hill came into view when she rounded the last curve in the road. Her place on the east slope was visible now in winter, the earthen berm along its north face, dark against the snow, the south-facing windows she had fitted in August catching the low afternoon light. Below at the chamber door, a dark rectangle in the hillside, legible as a door only to someone who already knew to look for straight lines and a rock face. She climbed the slope. She stood at the chamber door for a moment without opening it. The afternoon light was the low copper-colored light of November at this latitude, the light that reached into things rather than illuminating their surfaces. She could hear the valley below. Not voices, just the ambient presence of inhabited space, the sound that open country makes when it contains lives being lived in it. 1 year, the farm had kept running without her. She had kept running without it. The hill had kept its temperature without consulting either of them. She thought about Pruitt at his table in the winters before she existed, recording his temperatures in his careful hand, building his argument against loss in the only material he had found reliable: observation measurement, the patient accumulation of what the hill actually did, rather than what a man might hope it would do. 2 failed chimney configurations and 1 near suffocation before the correct angle. Root vegetables in open bins going soft by January until the sand method solved it. Every failure recorded with the same precision as every success, because the failures were the mechanism by which the successes had been arrived at, and discarding them would have been discarding the reasoning. She thought about 7 people in a room built for one. She thought about Josephine's hands spread near the stove on the first evening and the specific quality of Ruth's expression over her daughter's sleeping head. She thought about Silas choosing the right wall by instinct, about Mabel's 30 seconds of humming in the worst night of the storm, about a blue wool shawl left on a step by hands she would never know. These were the things that held, not because they were exceptional, because they had been prepared for the length of the cold or offered without calculation in the middle of it, which amounted to the same thing: a sufficiency available when sufficiency was what the situation required. She was not the same person who had stood in the yard in November of the year before, listening to the sounds of a household continuing without her. She was not worse and she was not better. She was more precise. She had been given by a dead man's ledger and a hill's indifference to seasons, and 7 people who needed managing through 4 weeks of a hard winter, a more accurate accounting of what she was worth than the one she had been handed at the kitchen door with a canvas pack and instructions to find work in town. The accounting had come out differently than Harlan's. She pressed her palm against the stone of the doorframe, the spot worn smooth by Pruitt's hand over 7 winters of the same gesture, the rock beneath her fingers carrying the warmth of the hill's interior. Not the warmth of the stove, not the warmth of the afternoon sun, but the specific warmth of 47 degrees held constant in earth below the frost line, returning itself through stone to the surface of a hand that knew how to read it. She stood there for a moment with her palm against the warm stone and let the year exist behind her in its full weight: the morning in the kitchen, the walk into the hills, the door with its straight edge, Pruitt's handwriting, the fire built in the dark from birch bark and instinct, and the careful notes of a man who had converted grief into methodology. Ruth's eyes over Josephine's sleeping head, the shape of Turner Crane's excavation from the hillside above. She opened the door. She went down into the warmth the hill had been keeping for her, the warmth it kept without being asked, without needing to know who would come to use it or when. She sat beside the stove and was still. Outside, the first snow of the second season moved across the valley with the patience of something that had done this before. The road disappeared. The distances between farmhouses compressed into white. The hill absorbed the storm the way it absorbed everything, not by resisting, but by having enough mass that what arrived at its surface did not reach what it was protecting. Somewhere in the valley, in the new structures people had built over the summer, along the lines of a principle they had observed and understood and made, their own other fires were burning. She could not see them from here. She did not need to. She reached out and pressed her palm flat against the stone wall beside the stove. It was still warm.